Anonymity, actions without identity. Opening, the question nobody asks out loud. Here is a question that sounds almost philosophical until you sit with it for a moment. Can you prove you did not do something? Think about what that requires. It requires that every action you take leaves a traceable signature, a log entry, a timestamp, a network connection, a credential used, so that the absence of your signature on a particular action constitutes evidence. It requires that your identity is reliably attached to your behavior at all times. And it requires that the system recording all of this is trustworthy, complete, and tamper-resistant. In other words, proving innocence depends entirely on the integrity of the accountability system. And the accountability system depends on identity being known. Now flip it. What happens when identity is deliberately severed from action? What happens when someone, a threat actor probing your infrastructure, a whistleblower reporting a fraud, a malware analyst examining a live command and control server, a legitimate user accessing a service through Tor, moves through your environment without a traceable identity attached to their behavior? That is the subject of this session. Anonymity, as a principle, is not simply the absence of a name. It is the deliberate architectural severance of the link between an action and the person who performed it. And that severance is one of the most consequential properties in security because it cuts both ways with equal force. The attacker who hides behind Tor is exploiting the same technical mechanisms as the journalist who protects a source. The malware author who builds a botnet from anonymized IP ranges is using the same networking primitives as the threat researcher who probes that botnet without revealing their employer. The disgruntled employee who files a fake harassment report anonymously is using the same platform architecture as the junior accountant who finally, after 3 years of fear, reports their manager's embezzlement scheme. Anonymity does not distinguish between the virtuous and the malicious. It is infrastructure neutral. Understanding it, what it is technically, where it breaks, how to design systems that use it responsibly, and how to detect when it is being exploited, is a capability that separates the practitioner who has thought deeply about identity from the one who has only deployed firewalls. The foundation, what anonymity actually means. Most people use the word anonymity as a synonym for privacy. They are not the same thing, and confusing them leads to architectural mistakes that are expensive to unwind. Privacy is about the content of information. When you encrypt a message, you protect the content from people who should not see it. The message is private, but the metadata may still be visible. The fact that you sent something, when you sent it, to whom, and how large the message was, all of that can remain entirely visible even when the content is encrypted. You have privacy without anonymity. Anonymity is about the link between an action and an actor. When something is truly anonymous, the action exists but cannot be connected to a specific person. The content of what was said or done may be fully visible. What is hidden is who said or did it. You can see that a message was sent. You cannot see who sent it. Pseudonymity sits in the middle. A pseudonym is a stable identifier that is not your real name. On many internet forums, you have a username. That username is consistent. Your posts accumulate under it. You can be replied to. Your reputation builds. But nobody knows your real name. This is pseudonymity. It provides social accountability within a context while hiding real-world identity. The important thing to understand about pseudonymity is that it is fragile. A single correlation event, a leak of the registration email, a post that inadvertently mentions a detail unique to one person, a metadata artifact embedded in an uploaded file, can shatter the pseudonym and link it permanently to a real identity. When regulators talk about anonymized data, they are making a claim about this same unlinkability. Personal data is considered truly anonymous when it cannot be reasonably relinked to an individual. The standard here is much harder to meet than most compliance teams realize. A dataset containing age, postal code, and gender can re-identify 87% of Americans, because those three fields combined are unique to individuals at a frightening rate. What looks like anonymized data in isolation often becomes identifiable when joined with other datasets that are publicly available. The concept of an anonymity set is central to understanding how robust any anonymization scheme actually is. The anonymity set is the group of subjects among whom you are indistinguishable. If 10,000 people are all sending traffic through the same anonymizing infrastructure, you are hidden among 10,000 candidates. Your anonymity set is large. If only 3 people are using a particular anonymizing path, and an observer can narrow the candidate pool to 3, you are hidden among 3 candidates. Your anonymity set is dangerously small. Attacks against anonymity systems almost always work by shrinking the anonymity set until it contains one person. There is one more concept to place here before moving forward: non-repudiation. Non-repudiation is the security property that ensures someone cannot credibly deny having performed an action. Digital signatures achieve this by cryptographically binding a specific private key to a specific action. If you signed a transaction with your private key and the signature verifies, you cannot plausibly claim you did not sign it. Non-repudiation and anonymity are direct opposites. You cannot have both at once on the same action. A system that guarantees accountability for every action by definition eliminates anonymity. A system that guarantees anonymity by definition eliminates accountability. The architectural question in every real-world implementation is not which one you choose absolutely, but where you draw the line, for which users, under which circumstances, and with what governance around the exceptions. The central tension: identity anchors trust and trust anchors everything. The reason anonymity is genuinely difficult to reason about in security is that the entire infrastructure of access control, accountability, and forensics rests on the assumption that identity is knowable. The moment you introduce a design requirement that explicitly severs identity from action, you are pulling on a thread that runs through the entire security architecture. Access control, the decision about who is allowed to do what, is predicated on knowing who is asking. Role-based access control, attribute-based access control, mandatory access control. Every model starts with an authenticated identity. Remove the identity, and access control collapses into either allowing everything or allowing nothing. Audit logging, the mechanism by which you reconstruct what happened after an incident, depends on identity being attached to events. A log entry that says a file was accessed at 3 a.m. from an internal subnet is meaningful. A log entry that says a file was accessed at 3 a.m. from an IP address that routes through an anonymizing proxy tells you a great deal about the action and almost nothing about the actor. Forensics, the practice of attributing actions to individuals for legal or HR purposes, requires the chain of identity to be intact. If an attacker has moved through your environment while routing through a mixed network or Tor, the forensic picture of their path may be completely clear, while the forensic picture of their identity remains entirely blank. Yet the tension does not resolve simply by saying, therefore anonymity is always bad. The counterexample is immediate and concrete. A company that wants its employees to report harassment, fraud, or safety violations faces a genuine problem if the only reporting channel available is a corporate email form. Employees know that it can read that form. They know their name is in the metadata. They know that if the person they are reporting is senior and vindictive, retaliation is a real risk. The result is silence. The embezzlement continues. The harassment continues. The safety violation remains unreported until it becomes a catastrophe. The absence of an anonymous channel in that context is not a security feature. It is a suppression mechanism. This is the productive tension that should run through your thinking every time anonymity comes up. Identity enables accountability, and accountability enables security. But identity also enables targeting, surveillance, and retaliation, and the possibility of those things silences exactly the kinds of reporting that institutional security depends on. You cannot resolve this tension by picking a side. You have to learn to hold both sides with equal clarity. The architecture, how anonymity is built into systems. When you need to design a system that provides genuine anonymity, rather than the theatrical kind that breaks on the first correlation attempt, there are several architectural mechanisms to understand, each with a different threat model and a different set of failure conditions. The most widely understood anonymizing infrastructure is the Tor network. Tor works by routing traffic through a series of volunteer-operated relay nodes, with each layer of routing encrypted separately. Think of it as a nested set of envelopes. The sender encrypts the message first for the exit node, then wraps that in an encryption for the middle relay, then wraps that in an encryption for the entry guard. Each relay decrypts only its own layer and forwards the inner package to the next hop. The exit node sees the destination but not the origin. The entry guard sees the origin but not the destination. No single node in the circuit sees both. The anonymity derives from the fact that correlating the entry and exit requires an adversary who controls or observes both simultaneously, which is computationally and logistically demanding. The important failure modes for Tor are worth naming explicitly. The first is traffic analysis at scale. If a state-level adversary can observe a significant fraction of Tor's entry and exit traffic, they can perform timing correlation attacks, matching the statistical pattern of packets entering the network with the statistical pattern of packets exiting, to de-anonymize users even without breaking the cryptography. The second is endpoint compromise. If the machine running Tor is compromised, or if the browser being used over Tor leaks the real IP through JavaScript, WebRTC, or DNS requests, the cryptographic anonymity of the routing layer is irrelevant. The third is the small anonymity set problem. When Tor traffic is used for a very specific purpose from a small population of users, correlation across sessions becomes feasible even without full network observation. Mixed networks address a different aspect of the problem. Tor hides the routing path but preserves the timing pattern to some degree. A mixed network also shuffles the ordering of messages, introducing artificial delays and batching to destroy timing correlation. The cost is latency, sometimes significant. This makes mixed networks poorly suited to interactive applications, but well suited to applications where communication latency can be tolerated in exchange for stronger anonymity guarantees. An anonymous email system built on a mixed network provides a level of anonymity that Tor alone does not, because the timing patterns that could leak identity are deliberately destroyed. Zero-knowledge proofs are a different kind of anonymity mechanism, and they operate at the authentication layer rather than the routing layer. A zero-knowledge proof is a cryptographic construction that allows one party to prove they know something, a password, a credential, membership in an authorized group, without actually revealing what they know. In a conventional authentication system, you prove you know the password by sending the password, or a hash of it. A zero-knowledge system allows you to prove, I possess a valid credential, without revealing anything about that credential that could identify which specific credential it is. The application to privacy-preserving authentication is significant. You can design a system where a user proves they belong to an authorized group without revealing which member of that group they are. This breaks the link between action and identity at the credential layer, which is fundamentally different from hiding it at the routing layer. Privacy-preserving financial transactions, most notably Monero, use a combination of ring signatures and stealth addresses to break the link between sender and receiver in a transaction ledger. In a conventional blockchain like Bitcoin, the ledger is public and the transaction graph, who sent to whom, is fully visible even if the real-world identities behind the addresses are initially unknown. Accumulate enough data about spending patterns, and the identities behind addresses eventually emerge. Monero addresses this by mixing the true sender's transaction with a ring of decoy transactions, so that any observer sees one of several plausible senders, but cannot determine which is real. Stealth addresses ensure that even the receiver's address is unique per transaction, making it impossible to link multiple receipts to the same wallet by examining the public ledger. The cost is that auditability, the ability to prove the transaction history, requires cooperation from the parties, since the public ledger alone no longer provides it. The tools and what they cannot do. Each of these mechanisms materializes the principle of anonymity differently, and each comes with costs that are worth examining honestly rather than glossing over. Network address translation provides what might be called incidental anonymity. When an organization routes outbound traffic through a NAT gateway, the internal IP addresses of individual machines are hidden from the external destination. A web server receiving a request sees only the public IP of the organization's perimeter, not the internal IP of the specific workstation. This hides the internal topology, which is useful, but it is a very weak form of anonymity because it only hides identity within the organization. The organization itself is still fully identifiable. The ISP still has records. Law enforcement with appropriate authority can query those records and identify not just the organization, but through internal NAT logs, the specific machine and user. NAT provides anonymity against the destination, not against a serious investigator. Architects who treat NAT as an anonymity control, rather than a routing mechanism, misunderstand its actual threat model. A threat intelligence platform that includes anonymizing egress for research purposes is a more serious tool. When an analyst at an MSSP or MDR provider needs to visit a threat actor's infrastructure, to probe a command and control server, to download and analyze a malware sample from a distribution site, to register on a criminal forum to observe TTPs, doing so from the organization's real IP address has consequences. The threat actor may see the analyst's IP, identify it as belonging to a security company, and modify their infrastructure to hide activity from known security research IP ranges. Worse, they may specifically target the analyst organization in retaliation. Proxying research through a dedicated clean IP infrastructure, rotated regularly and not attributable to any security firm, is the operational security requirement here. The cost is that this infrastructure must be maintained, its IP reputation managed, and its use governed carefully so it is not mistaken for actual malicious activity by other security teams. An ethics hotline platform built on genuinely anonymous submission architecture is a different deployment context entirely. The requirement here is not to hide from threat actors, but to make it safe for insiders to report genuine wrongdoing. The platform must not log IP addresses. It must not embed session identifiers in the submission portal that could be correlated with corporate network logs. It must not require any identifying information as part of the report itself. The case key system, where the reporter is given a random string they can use to check the status of their report without ever providing their identity, is an essential design feature. The failure mode to design against is the case where a determined internal IT administrator, upon receiving a damaging report about a senior executive, attempts to identify the reporter by correlating access logs, network flows, and authentication records against the timing of the submission. The genuine anonymous platform must be architecturally resistant to this correlation, even by a motivated insider with privileged access. The cost of the genuine anonymous platform is twofold. First, there is the financial cost of a specialized third-party service rather than an internal tool. Second, and more difficult, there is the abuse surface. An anonymous channel is, by design, a channel where false reports cannot be easily traced back to their source. A disgruntled employee can file vexatious reports. A person conducting a targeted harassment campaign against a colleague can anonymously file multiple accusations designed to trigger investigations. The mitigation is not to eliminate anonymity, because that eliminates the legitimate reporter along with the bad actor, but to require evidence for a report to advance beyond initial receipt. A report that includes a document, a photograph, a transaction record, or any other substantiating artifact is substantially harder to fabricate at volume. The architecture filters for seriousness without filtering for identity. Implementation, building what the theory describes. Let us move from mechanisms to the experience of actually building these systems, because the gap between the theory and the practice is where most failures occur. Consider the task of deploying an internal network monitoring capability, an intrusion detection sensor, that must detect anomalous lateral movement, including movement by an attacker who is attempting to operate without leaving obvious identity traces. The attacker knows that logging and identity attribution are your primary detection mechanisms. They move slowly. They reuse credentials already present in the environment. They avoid creating new accounts. They time their activity to blend with normal business hours. They route through internal services that are supposed to be talking to each other, so their traffic generates no firewall alerts. Detecting this kind of movement requires you to abandon the assumption that identity will be attached to the behavior you are looking for. Instead, you shift to behavioral anomaly detection. You are not looking for a name in a log. You are looking for a pattern. The pattern might be an internal host communicating with another internal host it has never spoken to before. It might be a service account, which should only be calling specific APIs, suddenly initiating SMB connections to workstations. It might be a sequence of file accesses that individually are unremarkable but collectively represent a systematic trawl through a directory structure. The detection works not by matching a known identity, but by recognizing that the behavior is inconsistent with the baseline, regardless of who is performing it. This is the implementation insight that anonymity forces on defenders. When identity is absent or unreliable, behavioral baselines become the detection primitive. Building those baselines requires time, data, and careful calibration. You need a period of observation long enough to capture the normal variation in your environment, including the legitimate anomalies like month-end financial processing, quarterly audits, and IT maintenance windows, before you can reliably detect the abnormal variation that indicates something hostile. Now consider the implementation of the ethics hotline platform described in the scenario from the skeleton file. An organization wants to allow employees to report harassment and fraud anonymously because they have strong reason to believe employees are self-censoring out of fear. The implementation has several layers, each of which must be handled correctly or the anonymity guarantee collapses. The first layer is access. Employees must be able to reach the reporting platform without the access itself being logged in a way that identifies them. Accessing a web URL from a corporate laptop over the corporate network creates a DNS query, a network flow record, and potentially a proxy log. If the URL of the ethics hotline is visible in those logs, the act of visiting the site is itself attributable. The recommendation is to provide both a personal device access option. Employees can use their own phone on a personal data connection. And, for employees who lack that option, a clear browser access point in a physical location like a conference room where the machine is not assigned to a specific user. The guidance should explicitly name the Tor browser as an option for employees who want the highest degree of access anonymity. The second layer is the platform itself. The platform must be hosted externally, not on internal infrastructure. It must use a domain that does not appear in corporate web filtering allow lists, because those lists may be auditable. It must not require any account creation or login. Critically, the platform's privacy policy must explicitly commit to not logging IP addresses, not storing browser fingerprints, and not cooperating with any corporate data request that attempts to de-anonymize a report. This last point requires a contractual commitment in the vendor agreement, not just a UI label. The third layer is the case key system. After submission, the reporter is shown a unique case identifier, a random string like a tracking number. This key is not stored anywhere linked to the report content. It is the reporter's only mechanism for follow-up. The case handler sees the report and can request additional information via the platform, but every exchange remains identity-free. The limitation is real. If the case handler needs to interview the reporter, that interview must take place through the platform's messaging system, not a phone, call, or email, because those channels reattach identity. The fourth layer is the governance structure. Who receives these reports? Who decides whether a report advances to investigation? If the compliance team receives a report about the CFO, the investigation cannot be led by the CFO's direct reports. An independent investigation committee or an external firm must handle reports about senior personnel. The anonymity architecture protects the reporter. The governance architecture protects the process from being corrupted by the subject of the report. When the system breaks, diagnosing anonymity failures. Understanding how anonymity fails in practice is at least as valuable as understanding how it is supposed to work. Let us work through several failure scenarios in the way an investigator would. The first scenario is a YARA rule that stops detecting a known malware family. A malware analyst has written a YARA rule to detect an IoT botnet malware strain based on specific shell command strings embedded in captured binaries. Strings like particular download paths, specific base64 encoded payloads, and a characteristic mutex name used for process coordination. The rule has been working reliably for 6 weeks. Then it stops generating detections. New samples arrive that look behaviorally similar, but the rule does not fire. The first thing to check is the most obvious. Has the rule been deployed and is it running? Has there been a pipeline change that might have broken the scanning step? You verify this by running the rule manually against a sample you know it previously detected. It fires. The rule works. The problem is not the rule, it is the samples. The second thing to check is what changed in the samples. You take a new sample and a previous sample and compare them structurally. File size, entropy, import table, nothing dramatic. You look at the strings. The specific download path has changed. The base64 payload is new. The mutex name which you had anchored the rule on is now different, but only those 3 strings changed. Everything else in the binary, including the compiler artifacts, the runtime libraries, and the overall control flow structure, is identical. The malware author made a trivial modification specifically to burn the signature. They did not rebuild the tool. They found the strings that the YARA rule was matching and changed them. This is the most common evasion technique against signature-based detection, and it happens with high frequency in actively maintained malware families. The anonymity the malware author seeks is not geographic, it is taxonomic. They want their samples to be uncategorized, not attributed to a known family, so that detection coverage does not propagate to the environments their botnet is targeting. The fix requires making the YARA rule more robust against trivial string changes. Instead of anchoring on specific paths that an author can easily modify, you anchor on structural features that are harder to change without rebuilding the tool entirely. The XOR encoding key used for string obfuscation, if consistent across the family. The sequence of syscall patterns. The characteristic way the binary handles network connection retries. These are implementation decisions baked into the code logic, not surface strings that can be swapped in a text editor. Building rules at this level requires deeper static analysis, but it produces signatures that force the author to do significant re-engineering work to evade, rather than a 5-minute string replacement. The second scenario involves a zero-trust rollout where anonymous internal requests begin causing failures. An organization is migrating to a zero-trust architecture. They enforce identity-aware proxy policies for internal application access. Within 48 hours of enforcement, several internal services begin failing with access-denied errors. The help desk receives escalations. The proxy logs show requests being blocked because no valid identity assertion accompanies them. The first step is to look at the blocked requests and categorize them. Are they coming from user workstations, service accounts, IP addresses that correspond to infrastructure rather than endpoints? The categorization reveals that the overwhelming majority of failures are coming from service accounts and machine identities. These are accounts used by applications to communicate with other applications, scheduled jobs, monitoring agents, backup systems, inter-service API calls. They were configured years ago, they run silently, and nobody thought about them when designing the zero-trust rollout, because the policy architects were thinking about human users. The second step is to understand why these service accounts lack valid identity assertions. In many cases, the service accounts were originally configured to authenticate using a shared secret or a local credential that is not recognized by the new identity provider. They were never enrolled in the corporate IDP. They have no certificate. They have no OIDC client credentials. They simply used their source IP address and network position as their implicit identity, and the zero-trust architecture, by design, rejects that. The third step is to decide what to do with each service account. You cannot simply add all service accounts to an exception list and return to implicit trust for machine identities. That recreates the exact attack surface the zero-trust architecture was built to eliminate. You need to enroll each service account in a proper identity management framework. Machine identities should authenticate using certificates issued by a known CA, with short validity periods and automatic rotation. API-to-API calls should use OAuth client credentials with scoped permissions. The fix takes time and coordination, but the alternative, a standing exception that says anything coming from these IP ranges does not need to authenticate, is a permanent hole in the architecture. The third scenario involves an anonymous DDoS attack launched from what appears to be a botnet. The organization is under a volumetric attack that is saturating their upstream bandwidth. The traffic is coming from hundreds of thousands of source IP addresses distributed across dozens of countries and multiple network providers. Each individual source sends only a modest volume. No single source IP is large enough to justify a block by itself. The anonymity of the attack, the fact that it is distributed across a massive, non-attributable source pool, is precisely what makes it effective. The first thing to check is whether the attack traffic has any common structural characteristics despite the diversity of source addresses. Even botnets with large, geographically distributed footprints often share artifacts from the attack toolkit. The same HTTP user agent string, the same TCP window size, the same ordering of HTTP headers. These low-level protocol fingerprints can identify traffic as originating from the same tool, even when the source IP addresses span the globe. The second thing to examine is whether the traffic has a pattern that separates it from legitimate user traffic. DDoS traffic from botnets often shows unnaturally regular request intervals. The bots are timed by a C2 beacon rather than by human behavior. Legitimate traffic has irregular interarrival times that follow a human pattern. Detecting this pattern requires per-source analysis in the traffic flow, which is computationally expensive at the volume of a DDoS. But modern DDoS mitigation platforms perform exactly this analysis. The third and most important step for future resilience is to understand what the attacker was trying to achieve, and whether the DDoS was a primary objective or a distraction. A volumetric attack that consumes all available analyst attention is a classic technique for covering a simultaneous, quieter intrusion attempt on a different vector. While the SOC is watching the DDoS dashboard, a credential stuffing campaign is running against the VPN gateway. Containing the DDoS and simultaneously maintaining normal monitoring sensitivity across other attack surfaces requires tooling and process discipline that many organizations discover they lack only when they actually need both at once. 3 roles, 3 encounters with anonymity. The threat intelligence analyst at an MSSP sits down on Monday morning to build a campaign tracking report for a client in the financial sector. Over the weekend, the honeypot infrastructure captured a new cluster of SSH brute force sessions with an unusual HASSH fingerprint that does not match any known tool in the database. The sessions are coming from a range of source IP addresses spread across residential ISP blocks in 3 countries, all routing through known VPN exit nodes. The analyst's job is to turn this raw observation into intelligence, and the first obstacle is that the anonymization of the source infrastructure makes attribution nearly impossible. The analyst does not attempt to unmask the attacker directly, because that is almost certainly beyond the available intelligence without law enforcement access. Instead, they focus on what can be attributed: the tool, the technique, and the targeting pattern. The HASSH fingerprint is consistent across all sessions in the cluster, which means the same SSH client binary is being used regardless of which VPN exit node the traffic is emerging from. The command sequences executed after successful authentication follow a consistent script, checking for cryptocurrency mining software, examining available disk space, creating a hidden directory in a standard path. This behavioral signature is stable even when the identity behind it is deliberately hidden. The campaign tracking report is built around the tool behavior and the target selection logic, not around the attacker's identity. The intelligence is actionable for the client even without attribution, because the client can deploy detection rules against the behavioral signature without needing to know who wrote it. The security architect encounters anonymity during the design phase of an internal ethics reporting system. The business requirement is clear. Employees must be able to report misconduct without fear of retaliation, and the previous system, a corporate email address managed by the HR department, was trusted by nobody. The architect faces a specific design challenge. Every element of the corporate infrastructure that the reporting system might touch has the potential to reattach identity to the report. The DNS resolver logs the hostname lookup. The web proxy logs the URL. The authentication system logs the session. The corporate email system logs the IP address of any email sent to an external platform. The architect's response is to pull the reporting channel completely outside the corporate infrastructure boundary. The platform is third-party, hosted externally, accessed over HTTPS with a domain that does not appear in corporate DNS. The guidance to employees explicitly addresses the residual risks, that accessing it from a corporate laptop over the corporate network still generates a DNS query and a network flow record, even if the content is encrypted. The recommended access path is a personal device on a personal network. For employees without that option, a dedicated browser in a cleanroom conference room is provisioned, not associated with any user account. The architect documents each of these decisions, the risks they address, and the residual risks they do not address, because the governance documentation is as important as the technical architecture. The SOC analyst at level 2 receives an escalation about suspicious activity on an internal file server. A junior analyst has flagged a series of access events against a sensitive directory, documents related to a pending merger. The access events are spread across 2 hours, involve 37 individual files, and appear in the logs under a service account named something innocuous like Backup SVC. The junior analyst's initial assessment is that it might be a legitimate backup job. The L2 analyst knows it is not and works through why. The first check is the backup schedule. The organization's backup jobs run nightly between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. These accesses happened at 11:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. That eliminates the legitimate backup explanation immediately. The second check is the pattern of access. A real backup job reads files in the order they appear in the directory because it is enumerating the directory and reading sequentially. These accesses do not follow that pattern. They are accessing specific files by name, suggesting the actor knew which files they wanted rather than sweeping everything. The third check is the originating host. The service account's normal network behavior, visible in flow logs from the previous 30 days, shows it exclusively communicating with a backup server appliance on a dedicated backup VLAN. These accesses originated from a workstation on the general corporate LAN. Something is using the backup service account's credentials from a machine that is not the backup server. The attacker has used a service account as an anonymizing layer inside the environment. By operating under a service account identity, they hope to blend their activity into infrastructure noise. The L2 analyst's job is now to trace back to the compromised workstation that is impersonating the service account, isolate it, preserve the memory forensics before any remediation, and determine how the service account credentials were obtained, likely through credential harvesting from a previous endpoint compromise. The anonymity was partial and it failed, but it delayed detection long enough for significant data to be accessed. Case scenario: the whistleblower platform under legal pressure. Let us close the technical content with a scenario that carries the full weight of the principle and the constraint. A multinational pharmaceutical company is under internal investigation by its own compliance office. Over the past 2 years, a series of anomalies in clinical trial data from one of their regional offices have emerged during routine audit sampling. The anomalies suggest potential data fabrication, not minor discrepancies, but systematic alterations that, if confirmed, would represent fraud affecting drug approval submissions. The compliance team has reason to believe that multiple people in the regional office are aware of the problem but have not come forward. The company has an ethics hotline. It is a corporate tool managed by the internal compliance team, accessible via the company intranet and requiring login with a corporate Active Directory account. The implicit identity requirement is baked into the access mechanism. Nobody at the regional office has used it to report the clinical trial issue, and nobody is going to. The compliance team brings in an external security architect to implement a genuinely anonymous reporting channel as an emergency deployment. The constraint is significant. The legal team has informed the compliance office that if any report received through this channel is to be used in a potential criminal prosecution, the chain of custody of the report must be documentable, the platform must be demonstrably tamper-proof, and the organization cannot guarantee the reporter anonymity from law enforcement if a court order compels disclosure. This last point is the constraint that cannot be engineered away. True legal anonymity, the kind that withstands a judge's order, requires a third-party platform in a jurisdiction with robust whistleblower protection laws, and even then it is not absolute. The architect makes several decisions under this constraint. First, the platform selected is hosted in a European Union jurisdiction by a vendor that specializes in whistleblower protection infrastructure, and whose terms of service explicitly state they will challenge court orders compelling disclosure before complying. This does not eliminate the risk of court-compelled disclosure, but it adds friction and legal process to any de-anonymization attempt. Second, the company's legal team drafts a whistleblower protection policy that explicitly commits the company not to attempt to identify reporters through internal means, and not to use access logs, network forensics, or any other internal data to trace the source of a report. This policy is signed by the board and published externally, creating a reputational commitment that would be costly to violate. Third, the platform is launched with a communication campaign that explicitly tells employees what the company has committed to and what residual risks exist, not to discourage reporting, but because trust requires transparency. Within 6 weeks of deployment, 3 separate reports arrive through the platform. 2 of them provide photographs of documents. 1 provides a transaction record and a chain of emails forwarded from an internal system through a personal email account. These 3 reports, combined, provide the compliance team enough to launch a formal investigation through an independent law firm. The investigation confirms the data fabrication. The company makes a voluntary disclosure to the regulatory authority. At no point in this process does anyone know who the reporters are. The architect has designed the system to make that question unanswerable without extraordinary effort. But the reports came with evidence, which means the investigation did not depend on the reporters' identities. The anonymity enabled the disclosure. The evidence enabled the investigation. The 2 work in combination precisely as intended. The trade-offs made explicit. The platform costs more than an internal tool. The vendor selection required legal review across 2 jurisdictions. The whistleblower protection policy required board approval and introduced a governance commitment the company must now honor. The risk of false or malicious reports, while real, was mitigated by requiring evidence as a condition for advancement. The residual risk of court-compelled disclosure was disclosed to potential reporters, honestly rather than hidden behind a promise the architecture could not keep. This is what it means to design for anonymity as a property rather than as a checkbox. Every decision was made explicitly. Every trade-off was documented. The constraint was honored, not pretended away. Closing, what you carry into every identity conversation. There is a posture that this principle asks you to develop. It is not suspicion and it is not naivety. It is precision about what identity is, what it provides, and what depends on it. Every time you sit in a design review and someone says the system is secure because every action is logged and attributed, you now know the right question is, attributed to what? To a credential or to a person? To a device or to an individual? To a service account or to the human who compromised it? The attribution chain has links, and each link can be severed or fabricated. Every time you are asked to investigate an incident where the attacker left no clear identity trace, you now know the behavioral baseline is your primary instrument. You are looking for the shape of the action, not the name attached to it. Every time you design a system that involves sensitive human reporting, whether it is a security incident report, an ethics submission, or a safety observation, you now know that the channel's trustworthiness is only as good as its architectural guarantee of anonymity, and that guarantee is only as good as the documentation that supports it. Anonymity is not the enemy of accountability. It is the condition under which accountability sometimes becomes possible. The junior accountant who reported the embezzlement could only do so because the link between the action and the person was severed. The embezzlement was accountable, documented, investigated, prosecuted, because the report existed. Without the anonymity, the report would not have existed. Without the report, the accountability would not have been possible. Security professionals who think carefully about identity know that the goal is not to make identity inescapable. The goal is to make identity serve the right purposes, accountability where accountability matters, protection where protection matters, and to design with enough architectural clarity that the system cannot be used against the people it was meant to protect. That discipline is not a technical skill. It is a design philosophy, and it applies every time you decide who gets to know who did what and why. End of session mental model. Anonymity, actions without identity,